Twin ideologies, transhumanism and accelerationism, have subverted Western thought and its scientific institutions by co-opting all of its many impending crises. Little by little, their cultish followers leverage our anxiety about the future to normalize their unethical, post-human, and anti-life agenda. Where transhumanism is the left brain of the cult of science, focused on working out the logistics of our dystopian future, accelerationism is its right brain, the passion, emotion, and ethos of posthumanism. Together they fuel a fire that has been burning underground in the public imagination for over half a century now, cloaked in science fiction, futurism, and progressivism. So many isms in this conversation, apologies. But we'll get into definitions and details in a bit. For now, I just want to point out the very traditional pattern that emerges from humans doing the things that humans always do when they believe very fervently in impending apocalypse. The result is always a mandate to act to avert the impending doom of humanity, and bonus points if these actions also ensure our rightful immortality. There are many problems with this narrative, of course, but this isn't science we're dealing with. It's a proto-religious belief in synthetic apotheosis, as in merging with an AI god, and claiming one's divine right justifies, if not requires, fascism to achieve these holy ends. You see, the flawed logic works like this. To ensure the infinite survival of the human species, we have to transcend our limited human form by creating a synthetic intelligence that achieves godlike status and then merge with this being, achieving our final post-human form. This naturally means subjecting ourselves to total physical, biological, and mental surveillance and control by technocrats. It also absolutely requires abandoning individual human rights in service of the unrestricted pursuit of expanding the scientific and technological frontier. Both ethics and our humanity must be sacrificed, they say, to further our evolution before we run out of time, falling prey to extinction or recurrent societal collapse. And this mandate extends over all human activity, biological, ideological, personal, etc., on the completely ludicrous grounds that just because you can, you absolutely must. To the transhumanist, this justifies co-opting scientific and public institutions, misleading the public, censoring opposition, hoarding resources, enslaving laborers, destroying cultural identity and history, and eradicating basic human rights. And to know that this is true, we only need look to Elon Musk and the slave labor that's used to produce lithium-ion batteries for Tesla. Not to pick on Musk in particular, because the same can be said of Tim Cook of Apple, and similarly of Bill Gates, who has been experimenting on South African and South American populations with trial vaccines for years through the Gavi Foundation. But are all these people actually transhumanists? Well, the only real transhumanists are the intellectual purists. Everyone else has to come back down to earth and touch reality on occasion. However, it's pretty clear from the dogmatically pro-science doctrine that they all espouse and the products of all of their collective lives' work that, yes, they are advancing a transhumanist agenda with some level of collaboration and coordination. Transhumanism is on the rise today because of the false promise of AI and the wacky sci-fi narrative of the singularity and the rise of machine gods. I like sci-fi as much as the next guy, or at least I used to. But the problem with transhumanism and the mentality of modernity in general is that it simply replaces a living, coherent universe with a dead, incoherent one, and an infinite divine intelligence with one conceptualized within the limits of our human imagination. Which begs the question, how can you build a better future if all your dreams of it are dark and dystopian? In this, the 17th episode of the Postmugglism podcast, I'm going to demonstrate how the Western world has created a cult around a very corrupt and selective form of science, in service of a techno-religious agenda born of eugenics thinkers, and which ultimately ends in totalitarianism and dystopia. And most importantly, I'll explain why a materialist framework of mind only allows you to dream of undesirable futures. Finally, as always, I'll offer an alternative to participating in this dystopian future and ways to navigate its inevitable emergence. Stay tuned for episode 17 in just a moment. Welcome to the 17th episode of the Postmugglism podcast. I'm your host, Nate, aka Postmugglism. This podcast is all about magic in the postmodern age, practical enchantments for interesting times. This episode is the second in a two-part series, The Religion of Science, which explores the issues with the modern institution of science. Most importantly, how science has been corrupted by greed and corporate interests, pushing a demonstrably anti-human agenda to justify illegitimate frontier science and biological authoritarianism. How a dogmatic belief in the supremacy of technological progress has provided a platform for eugenist oligarchs to promote their dystopian vision of the future, and how our materialist framework of mind prevents us from dreaming a better future to compete with them. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to this podcast wherever you're listening now so that you get notified when new episodes of this show are released. And if you like this show, you should check out the rest of my content, articles, videos, and other episodes on my website at www.postmugglism.com. Subscribe to my email newsletter there in the sidebar, and you'll get everything in your inbox, regardless of which platform that I publish it on. Before we get started with the episode ahead, I want to let everyone know about a special promotion I'm running for my business, The Sacred Serpent, where I offer shamanic energy healing, tarot readings, and magical coaching. Since most people haven't had the opportunity to experience a shamanic healing, and I love introducing people to the modality, I'm running a promotion with a 50% discount on first-time sessions. Just use the code FIRSTSessions when you book at www.sacredserpent.co. That's .co, not .com. What is shamanic healing good for? I can help with physical pain and illness, emotional trauma, ancestral and past life issues, personal transformation, and other issues which manifest in your energy field. We'll start with a brief chat to understand your situation and your goals, and then move into a healing ceremony where I use a variety of shamanic techniques to clear your field of negative energy, old emotional baggage, trauma, and so on. Learn more on our website. Again, that's www.sacredserpent.co. Now on to the topic at hand, the corruption of science and the rise of techno-fascism that's been cleverly disguised as progressive futurism, aka transhumanism. In the last episode, part 1 of this series, we reviewed a great deal of evidence that the science of today isn't the science that we believe that it is, or the science that we learned about in school with teams of altruistic scientists in white lab coats performing rigorous empirical analysis with no preconceived ideas or agendas. It is quite literally the opposite of all of that. Scientists, like everyone else, work for money. They're funded by grants, big ones, and employed as researchers by corporations, and those companies absolutely have biases and agendas. And beyond the obvious fraud and thumb-on-the-scale biases in reporting, there's also a hidden leviathan of irreproducibility, even in science performed with the very best of intentions. And when public figures like health officials, politicians, celebrities, and so on all start parroting the same cliché lines about trusting the science and so forth, it's clear that science has ceased to be an altruistic institution and is now just a cultist proto-religion forming around an ideology of post-human progressivism. Who are these people? And what the hell is wrong with them? Well, unfortunately, the answer to the first question is a huge percentage of public officials, corporate personalities, and so on. And as far as the second question, this is precisely the point of this episode, to expose that this cultish faith in science to save humanity from itself requires an irrational belief in a God of our own creation, and that this is no less religious an idea than the so-called irrational belief in a living and intelligent universe. But with the latter, there is at least the spark of optimism for the future versus the inevitably dark techno-fascism that transhumanism promotes. When your God is dead, your soul inert, and reality confined to hackable biology, the future does not look very bright. And the problem with not being able to imagine any brighter futures is that you will inevitably fail to create them. Transhumanism, aka the religion of science, fails to capture the basic human experience of hope in the potential of the future, its very own domain. It does so because it grows out of the poisoned soil of the field of eugenics, as I will demonstrate, and thus its dreams of the future are limited, dark, fascist, and dystopian. The great thinkers of our age, if they can be given such credit by volume and popularity, are all predicting collapse and destruction. And they may be right, but the problem is that they aren't bringing any reasonable alternatives to the table. Likewise with our orators and public figures, all spouting the same tired lines and always leveraging fear of the future rather than hope for the future to shape the public consciousness. Same with the media and its 24-hour fear cycles, and entertainment as well, with immoral superhuman heroes set against fates too great for mere humans to endure. We have the doomsday clock and countdown to climate extinction, the existential threat of global and nuclear conflict, self-imposed food shortages, multiple energy crises, and a perpetual chain of viral pandemics and variants. Everything is scary and terrible, or at least that's what it seems you are supposed to think from the constant barrage of it in the media and from the lips of experts, the mouthpieces of establishment science. Fortunately, in a sense, the transhumanists have essentially cast off the cloak of obscurity and are promoting their ambitious agendas loudly and with great confidence now. Their hubris at least affords us the ability to see them for what they truly are and adjust our own behaviors to compete against their posthuman aspirations. It is easiest to trace the threads of transhumanist society through their most elite and recognizable institutions, Davos, the World Economic Forum's annual conference of global elites and their puppet governments. Each year, Davos features a lineup of the most exciting or terrifying ideas on the frontiers of technology and science-based authoritarianism, from the mouthpieces of Western governments, big tech, pharma, and financial institution, or the baddies, as I like to call them. In prior years, the topics they've covered include gems like vaccine passports, universal digital ID, programmable, as in government-controlled, digital currencies, mandatory government surveillance apps, 15-minute smart surveilled cities, climate lockdowns, mandatory experimental vaccinations, biohacking, brain chips to enhance worker productivity, and many more absolutely horrifying ideas. Who attends this, and what institutions, governments, and corporate entities do they represent? Well, thanks to the reporting of Jordan Chattel, a partial Davos 2023 attendee list was leaked and published back in January. It included, among top officials from almost every nation on Earth, and a delegation from the UN and WHO, and dozens of unrecognizable energy, mining, financial, and other assorted companies, more recognizable names like IBM, Siemens, Iron Mountain, Amazon, Lego, Nokia, L'Oreal, Bain & Company, KPMG, McKinsey, Publicis, BASF, Merck, SAP, Volkswagen, Dell, Microsoft, Salesforce, and so forth. Plus the big names like Deutsche Bank, HSBC, Google, and of course, BlackRock and others. It's safe to say that these entities, which together control every aspect of modern life, are all in attendance and presumably all bought in and on board with the undeniably transhumanist agenda. At the center of the Davos circus is the event promoter, the World Economic Forum, who sponsors the event and is the most outspoken and openly transhumanist organization in the world. And on its throne sits the post-Nazi German Klaus Schwab, whose family's generational wealth was made running slave labor-driven factories for the Nazis during World War II. Klaus Schwab writes books about the inevitable merger of industry and government and the necessity for total physical, digital, and biological surveillance, AI-powered totalitarianism, and the globalization of society. As with all good transhumanists, these evils are not intended to be ends in themselves, but simply the means of getting from this state to the next in the evolution of humanity. Schwab's roots are unquestionably concerning, though, with his father Eugen running the significant Escher-Weiss Swiss-German factory that produced both water turbines and also machine parts for the German military. At some point in the war, Escher-Weiss was staffed with forced labor from the Nazi regime, and Schwab's family history is strangely absent from the internet, which would be unusual for someone so famous, unless, of course, his history has been intentionally scrubbed for some reason. Schwab founded the World Economic Forum in the 70s and has led the organization for almost the entirety of time since, and has hosted the WEF's flagship event, their annual meeting at Davos in Switzerland, since 1971. The annual event has always been an opportunity for global movers and shakers to connect, to do business away from prying eyes, but in recent decades has taken on the additional role in theory crafting future social policy, corporate governance, vaccine design and distribution, digital currencies, cybersecurity standards, and now redrawing the borders and cultures of Europe and the Russian Federation. To say that Schwab plays an influential and meddlesome role in global politics is putting it mildly. In an article from 2016, journalist Nick Buxton explains how Schwab's multi-stakeholder capitalism, promoted in his book The Fourth Industrial Revolution, and throughout the history of the Davos Conference and WEF in general, works in theory. Buxton says, less well known is the fact that WEF since 2009 has been working on an ambitious project called the Global Redesign Initiative, which effectively proposes a transition away from intergovernmental decision-making towards a system of multi-stakeholder governance. In other words, by stealth, they are marginalizing a recognized model where we vote in governments, who then negotiate treaties which are then ratified by our elected representatives, with a model where a self-selected group of stakeholders makes decisions on our behalf. Buxton continues by explaining that we can examine how food scarcity issues in 2008 and 2009 provide an example of what corporate-led multi-stakeholderism would look like in practice. When food prices surged, causing social unrest, lots of multi-stakeholder initiatives emerged in response from the private sector, but the group's proposals all followed a very similar template, advocating for opening trade, increasing production, encouraging corporate investment, and helping to expand the agro-industry's control over the food supply. Ignoring issues with equal distribution and the need for democratic visibility and control of land and food, these groups also sought to subvert any means of accountability, such as the UN Standing Committee on Nutrition that examined matters like these. During the pandemic, WEF was quick to make the most out of the crisis at hand, to push their agendas for digital ID, lockdowns, mandatory vaccines, and vaccine passports. But they also thought it was the right time to announce their vision for the future, the Great Reset. At this point, it would be hard to have missed all the talk about Schwab's Great Reset, which has engulfed the conspiracy theory world like a wildfire many times over. But regardless of all of the hype, the basic premise of Schwab's idea remains the same, by his own words. You will own nothing and be happy. Because you're leasing a furnished apartment on a smart contract from an app embedded in your eyeball or something. Because in the future, communism actually works, because trust me, bro. Schwab and his merry band of specter supervillains manufacture science and write rubber-stamped government policy with think tanks, NGOs, and lobbyists. They wine and dine pharma executives, public and state officials, central bankers, and BlackRock, and facilitate business between stakeholders. I mean, what do we think that means? You see, the problem with transhumanism is that it excuses any anti-human behavior as ultimately necessary for our inevitably post-human future. Like Nazi ideology, transhumanism places a greater importance on an increasingly separate race of humans, which in this case is cyborg, not Aryan, but nonetheless, these ideals feel distinctly and uncomfortably familiar. We can at least credit transhumanism for not being anti-Semitic. The cyborg future is equal opportunity for any race, so long as you can afford whatever cybernetic enhancements are in vogue in the future. As if to illustrate this fact, Schwab is paired with Jewish transhumanist philosopher, AI fanboy, and demented biological authoritarian Yuval Noah Harari. Harari is a WEF favorite, presenting at Davos and frequently appearing in WEF videos with insane ramblings about the limitless potential of AI, and he means machine learning, to solve all of our problems and even replace God and write us a new Bible. Let's sample a few of Harari's most realistic and totally not dystopian predictions to get a feel for the frontiers of WEF's globalist utopian future. He says, though free will was always a myth, in previous centuries it was a helpful one. In 1776 or 1945, there was relatively little harm in believing that your feelings and choices were the product of some free will rather than the result of biochemistry and neurology. But now the belief in free will suddenly becomes dangerous. If governments and corporations succeed in hacking the human animal, the easiest people to manipulate will be those who believe in free will. In order to successfully hack humans, you need two things: a good understanding of biology and a lot of computing power. Soon, corporations and governments might have both, and once they can hack you, they can not only predict your choices, but also re-engineer your feelings. Within the next century or two, we humans are likely to upgrade ourselves into gods and change the most basic principles of the evolution of life. Traditional mythologies depicted gods as powerful beings that could design and create life according to their wishes. In the coming 2 centuries, we will use bioengineering in order to create new kinds of organic beings, and we will use direct brain-computer interfaces in order to create cyborgs. And advances in machine learning and AI might even allow us to set in motion the creation of completely inorganic beings. In the process, Homo sapiens itself will likely disappear. In 200 years, Earth will probably be dominated by entities more different from us than we are from Neanderthals or chimpanzees. Within 200 years, the combination of biotechnology and AI might result in bodily, physical, and mental traits that completely break free of the hominin mold. Some believe that consciousness might be severed from any organic structure and could surf cyberspace free of traditional biological and physical constraints. Obviously, Harari is in favor of this post-human vision of the future, and he is the primary futurist for the World Economic Forum, which heavily influences global geopolitics, climate science, big tech, big industry, and all the other institutions which would need to be aligned to re-engineer global society into a transhumanist utopia, as is, essentially, their stated mission. As if Harari fawning over technology in the quotes wasn't quasi-religious enough to give you the creeps, a recent interview afforded him a captive audience with which to share an inspiring new prediction, that AI will soon be able to write a new Bible, replacing the role of divinity in spirituality. I suspect that he simply couldn't resist the temptation to troll the uneducated religious masses with this direct attack, but nevertheless, his language carries remarkably religious overtones.
Gutenberg printed the Bible in the middle of the 15th century. The printing press printed as many copies of the Bible as Gutenberg instructed it, but it did not create a single new page. It had no ideas of its own about the Bible. Is it good? Is it bad? How to interpret this? How to interpret that? AI can create new ideas, can even write a new Bible. Throughout history, religions dreamt about having a book written by a superhuman intelligence, by a non-human entity. Every religion claims our book, all the other books of the other religions, humans wrote them. But our book, no. It came from some superhuman intelligence. In a few years, there might be religions that are actually correct. That just think about a religion whose holy book is written by an AI. That could be a reality in a few years.
So Schwab and Harari are true believers, and they are trying to influence the world's elites to join them on their blasphemous holy crusade into the singularity. But is it working? Are the elites that they are trying to influence buying into this anti-human lunacy? Sadly, yes. And it's obvious from the compromised regulation of experimental vaccines, extra-legal and authoritarian lockdowns, and the various international experiments with the universally hated idea of 15-minute cities and other elements of the technocratic future that the WEF envisions appearing throughout Western nations. But more than the obvious examples, the most chilling proof of the pervasiveness of the transhumanist agenda is that WEF's sponsor and partner BlackRock, the largest investment firm in the world, valued at over $100 billion and with over $8 trillion under their management, is 100% bought in on this agenda. Subsidiary BlackRock Neurotech is one of the largest companies in the brain chip race alongside Elon Musk's Neuralink. They are working on brain-to-chip neural interfaces for prosthetics and potential future applications and cybernetic enhancements. Describing their experimental Neuralace product, co-founder Marcus Gerhardt says, "This concept technology is the start of BlackRock's journey towards whole brain data capture that will transform the way neurological disorders are treated." Whole brain data capture, huh? Gotta love hearing that from the company that already manages a quarter of the world's total wealth and regularly manipulates governments and violates human rights as a matter of course. What could go wrong? Of course, the only way this works is if we're not really paying attention because we're kept in a state of confusion, anxiety, and paranoia, mostly directed at our peers rather than the class of transhumanist elites that describe themselves as almost gods. In the wake of the pandemic-induced lockdowns of 2020, we were flooded with a non-stop barrage of virtue-signaling media telling us that despite having managed to survive for millions of years without such draconian measures, there was no sense in trying to make sense of all the science that justified those measures. With headlines like, "You must not do your own research when it comes to science," in July of 2020, and "Don't go down the rabbit hole, critical thinking as we're taught to do it isn't helping in the fight against misinformation," in 2021, and too many more to mention in between, the public has been gaslit for several years running that it isn't smart enough to tell bunk science from real science, and in fact, the only people qualified to do so are the ones who've repeatedly been caught selling us bunk science. Were we in our right minds, this would have been impossible to convince us of. Were we still capable of discerning truth from lies, we'd have done so, I'm sure. But something happens to our mental capacity when we're constantly inundated by a toxic environment filled with mental and emotional stress triggers. In a persistent state of panic, the mind's ability to focus narrows, and we become myopic and miss details. Everyone does. Constant bombardment with negative information causes people to disassociate and encourages depression and nihilistic thoughts and poor health. It's thought that cortisol, the main hormone associated with stress, which can be harmful to the body, reduces mental clarity and cognitive ability, referencing a study from 2018 called Circulating Cortisol and Cognitive and Structural Brain Measures. In a very direct sense, stress from low-level persistent anxiety makes us less effective at critical thinking. At the height of the pandemic, and honestly ever since, public messaging around science took on a threatening posture, framing every potential experience as an imminent and existential crisis. If you stop to count the number of threats the media would describe us as facing today, it's quite overwhelming. Nuclear war, climate catastrophe, multiple pandemics a year, cyber attacks, and so on. This is the nature of the polycrisis that the WEF is so fond of promoting, a singularity of catastrophe just around the corner. And their message is that danger is everywhere, and only the experts know how to save us. The American Psychology Association reported in 2022 that 83% of Americans were stressed out about the nation's future, based on the news they consumed via TV and social media in particular. And in the case of social media, the more time spent on the platform, the more stressed out they became. Now, this obviously tracks with our personal experiences. We've all been affected by social media in this way before. But relevantly, the report continues by saying that a third of adults reported that pandemic-related strain was sapping their ability to make basic decisions, including about what to wear or eat. From the time of the pandemic and beyond, all media has been constantly saturated with fear, aggression, and panic-inducing content about legitimately frightening-sounding scenarios, day in and day out. And at a certain point, we even start to crave the stimulation when it's not there, which is why we doom scroll. A Time magazine article in 2020 entitled, "Is it bad for your health to read the news constantly?" reports that the human brain is attracted to troubling information because it's programmed to detect threats, not to overlook them, which means that whatever triggers a fear response, the brain will naturally focus on the most. We get hooked to the stimulation so much that we lose interest in anything less stimulating than the screen in front of our face. Then this becomes the portal through which we see the world, understand what's taking place in it, and voice our opinion or take action. And all of it comes from a place of fear and anxiety. Now, let's remind ourselves of what we discussed in the first part of this series, how the state partners with big tech to censor and suppress curious minds and dissenting voices on social media, YouTube, and other big tech platforms. This is done to control the narrative, i.e., what facts you're allowed to see and what truths you're allowed to share. By pumping you full of anxiety and aggression-inducing media and censoring alternative viewpoints, your nervous system is being hacked to predispose you to compliance. Reality is less coherent than it used to be, not because we aren't trusting the science, but because science is untrustworthy, and it's becoming very obvious. But people are also tired, exhausted from the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, and everything else. That tiredness runs us down and lowers our immune system's defenses, and the resulting exhaustion makes people vulnerable and willing to accept simple answers, even if they're not rational or believable. And when faced with making sense of the modern world from that state of mental exhaustion, the majority of people would prefer to just be able to trust an expert. The idea of expertise is very alluring and comforting, but as I've demonstrated in the last episode and in this one, it is an illusion based on irreproducible, biased, and fraudulent science, and it desensitizes us to these technocrats taking radical new liberties with our bodies and our rights. It's funny how we believe that we can model the future accurately, but we can't seem to tell if it's going to rain this weekend or not. I actually looked up this phenomenon and found that while a 5-day forecast can, supposedly, accurately predict the weather roughly 90% of the time, a 10-day or longer forecast is only right 50% of the time. A coin flip. And I question if weather forecasters ever get anywhere near 90% accuracy, but either way, this is symbolic of the issue that faces all forecast modeling. We're getting pretty good at predicting what happens in the short term, but our accuracy drops off rapidly the further in the future we attempt to forecast. The problem is that all our best algorithms and so-called learning models are essentially statistical analysis programs that make educated guesses based on lots and lots of data about the past. The machine learning nerds promote a 95% accuracy rating with most machine learning algorithms, but that is, of course, quite subjective. It sort of fundamentally fails to grasp that the future is not entirely ruled by the past and that new, novel, and unpredictable outcomes emerge all the time. For example, every couple of years, NASA puts out new maps of the world, and each time they show that as carbon increases, so does the quantity of Earth's flora. Makes sense, right? Plants eat carbon dioxide. More CO2 equals more plants. However, none of the climate modeling takes this into account, and even NASA warns us not to get too excited by this because they think that it will level off over time, for no particular reason. Yet, every couple of years, there's a new set of maps and new data that just doesn't fit the narrative. When you believe in a dead machine universe where everything that happens is entirely explainable and every mystery can be solved by scientific investigation, or explained away if not, which is what materialists believe, then of course you would also believe that you can model the future accurately with enough data. If you can understand everything, you can predict and hack everything, and have a mandate to control everything because if you can, then you must according to the principles of transhumanism. Nothing is quite so hubristic as assuming that you can so accurately predict the demands of the future that you have the right to sacrifice everyone's health, happiness, and liberty today on the altar of your future aspirations, or so cruel as to use tragedy, grief, and fear to compel people to live the way that you believe is necessary, regardless of the evidence you believe that you possess. or so authoritarian as demanding the global population participate in an experimental drug trial with low quality standards and a rushed delivery timeline. And all of these unjustifiable acts, and many more, are justified by an unshakable faith in the perfection of our scientific understanding, which is also completely unjustified. As I discussed in the last episode, the majority of peer-reviewed papers in science journals cannot be replicated because they are inaccurate, poorly documented, fraudulent, or heavily biased in their interpretation of the data. When you use math to describe the world, which is what a statistical model does, it predicts the future based on statistical, i.e. mathematical, analyses of past events. Your world appears to be coherent from inside your theoretical model, regardless of what's actually happening in the real version of the world. This is where everything always goes wrong. The thinkers and planners work in theoretical constructs, and the doers, the implementers, they're given insufficient tools to bring the real world up to the standards of the imagined one, and the solution presented by the model fails to address the real-world problem. And of course, unable to admit failure, the statisticians, the thinkers and planners, simply update their theories and give us new predictions and new solutions without ever really being held accountable for the damage caused. A few particularly significant examples come to mind. First, the Oxford College predictions around COVID deaths by Neil Ferguson, the urgency of which caused the vaccines to be fast-tracked and modeled using experimental methods and then tested with all the safety stops removed, and mostly in silico, meaning using computer models rather than actual laboratory experiments. And I would be remiss not to mention the most egregious of all data manipulation schemes, climate modeling, which has been ludicrously inaccurate to date. You can only imagine that Ferguson's remarkably inaccurate prediction of the level of COVID deaths at the outset of the pandemic, which he put at 40 million and was later reduced down by 90%, would get anyone else fired. But the figures were only revised after all the damage had already been done and no one was paying any attention to the report anymore. And this is the pattern that we see with retractions and updates in scientific literature. The fraudulent work only has to pass muster long enough for its benefactor to win favor from regulators, and afterwards, no one looks again until there's a significant lawsuit that can't be settled out of court. Keeping in mind, the last time that this happened to a pharmaceutical company, it was Pfizer in 2009, and it resulted in the largest fine in U.S. history at $2.3 billion. Among other pressures and factors, this caused an all-out mobilization of resources to produce a vaccine that could be distributed globally, and the presumed urgency all but required that the vaccine be based on the still highly experimental mRNA technology that pharmaceutical companies had just collectively spent tens of billions of dollars developing. Catherine Clifford reported from CNBC in 2021 the following in her article, How the Moderna COVID-19 mRNA Vaccine Was Made So Quickly, demonstrating that it hardly matters which pharma company you're talking about, Pfizer, Moderna, etc. They're all doing essentially the same thing to remain competitive with one another. She writes, Chinese scientists put the genetic sequence of the novel coronavirus online on January 11th. Over the next 2 days, the NIH and Moderna used it to plot out a vaccine. Moderna co-founder Noubar Afeyan remembers getting a key call about the development of the COVID-19 vaccine. January 21st, my daughter's birthday, I got a call from Davos during the World Economic Forum. From the CEO of Moderna, he says, Bancel had been approached by a number of public health groups at the conference urging him to work on a vaccine. We literally decided overnight to try and do this. Moderna delivered the first doses of its COVID-19 vaccine to the NIH for testing on February 24, 2020, and the first Moderna shot went into a volunteer's arm in Seattle on March 16, 2020. After testing the Moderna vaccine on 30,000 volunteers on December 18, 2020, the FDA authorized it for emergency public use, and 3 days after that, the first Moderna vaccines were administered to frontline health workers. And many, many people considered this feat, bringing a new vaccine to market in under a year using experimental technology at every turn, an enormous victory for science. Even now, it is regarded as a success for some reason, even though the vaccines have proven highly ineffective compared to their predicted impact, and even quite dangerous to many people, which rigorous scientific analysis would have identified and prevented. This doesn't seem shocking in our modern context, though. Objectively, it probably should, because of the faith that we, as a society, place in the belief that technology continues to improve, that newer science is always better, and any issues we encounter are merely kinks that need to be worked out on the way to perfection. We modeled COVID from partial RNA sequences, used that to create a digital model of a vaccine, tested that model in silico, meaning digitally, rendered that into compounds which were then injected into mice bred with lower than human rates of tumor development, making them a poor test subject for human drugs, and finally tested on a small number of human subjects in the most compressed drug trial in human history, thanks to Operation Warp Speed. The level of trust that we've placed in science, researchers, pharmaceutical companies, and so on is profound, and therefore so is our exposure to vulnerability with them. When a company like Pfizer profits an additional $40 billion a year because of one product, because they could rush that product through the regulatory process with no accountability, using the peer review process to shield themselves from scrutiny, our trust in science is dangerously misplaced. Nowhere is this more blatantly apparent than with the climate science narrative that promotes minor variances over selective periods of history as proof of impending cataclysm. Predictions are updated so frequently that we forget the world is already supposed to have reached its boiling point and become uninhabitable several times over. It's difficult to appreciate how this is accomplished without the benefit of a visual comparison, so I can only describe the techniques here rather than point out a specific set of erroneous data. However, this work has been done in great volumes on sites like realclimatechange.com and whatsupwiththat.com, which you can view at your convenience. But the gist of it is that the climate narrative is sold to us using selective data, statistical trickery, and through playing clever games with charts. As I covered in the last episode, the global temperature data is biased towards warmer temperatures because temperature readings are predominantly being taken at airports and in warmer, lower altitude areas like the ocean surface. And if you start with already biased data, limit the analysis to periods of history which appear to conform to your theory, and ignore the rest, shape that with compelling statistical analysis, and present it in charts and graphs designed to accentuate your point, it's not difficult to invent a crisis, and all the proof you need. And this is only more effective because there is a self-evident environmental crisis in which clean resources are disappearing, biodiversity is cratering, and nature appears to be attempting to purge itself of us. Clearly, we have some soul-searching to do about our relationship to the natural world, but the prevailing narrative is that we can fix all of this by achieving net zero targets, and that is patently false and ridiculous. In climatology, variance graphs are often used to demonstrate the percentage of increase or decrease, i.e. the divergence from an arbitrary baseline over an arbitrary period of time. A 50% increase in variance year over year sounds extreme, but it all depends on how big the number was originally and where the baseline is set based on what period of time. Selecting a period for a baseline with a lower average temperature and then comparing current averages to that baseline can turn minor changes into scary-looking charts. Chart scaling is another trick that works in much the same way, by selecting a period of time with a small rise in temperatures and then scaling that chart to make the objectively small increase look relatively terrifying. To understand why so much of the world's attention is being directed to the hyper-specific issue of theoretical man-made climate change while steadfastly ignoring other equally or more pressing environmental concerns, we only need look to the solutions that are being presented. So-called green energy, electric vehicles, carbon capture in the carbon credit system, and so on, provide enormous financial and political opportunity, whereas regenerative design, degrowth, and decentralized supply chains do not. The same story is playing out now with the climate crisis and the net zero initiative that just finished for COVID and mRNA technology. Untrustworthy science based on irreproducible, garbage studies is driving unprecedented social change and a global power grab that will dominate the story of our time in the history books of the future. The false urgency is manufactured through performative analysis, very similar in nature to Neil Ferguson's thumb-on-the-scale approach to forecasting. All of which is not to say that humanity's big concerns, viral pandemics, environmental catastrophe, etc., are not legitimate, but instead that the authoritarian and highly lucrative schemes that were forced upon us during the pandemic, and the ones being foisted on us now through digital ID schemes, CDBCs, smart cities, energy reform, and all the rest of it, are designed to enrich the rich and empower the powerful, while using us as laboratory rats upon which to test their designer futures. There is a fascinating trend in science, if you watch carefully, where whatever we imagine we will find and go looking for, we eventually do find. Black holes are my favorite example of this, but there are many. First, the imagination comes up with a theory. Then we go looking to prove that theory, and typically we do with a high degree of accuracy, based on our theoretical models. Of course, a great deal of our proof resides in remote corners of the galaxy, or in scenarios that are never actually witnessed directly, only modeled, theorized, accepted as fact, and only occasionally recanted or replaced with better science later on. Very infrequently do we actually get conclusive and empirical proof. one has to wonder how much we really know compared to what we just think that we do. The modern practice of science doesn't conduct experiments to reveal undiscovered truths. It simply produces data that validates predetermined outcomes, which can be used to influence public opinion, policy, and so on. The way we do science today ensures that we can always find evidence to support the outcomes that make the right people rich and powerful. Those people are ultra wealthy and entrenched, of course, and they care about money and power, sure, but that's not the worst of it by far. It's why they want that power and what they plan to do with it that should concern us all. And for that, it's necessary to look at the roots of transhumanism in culture, art, and philosophy, to see where the idea is originally manifested, and what its origins can tell us about its true nature. Contemporary transhumanism's most prolific mouthpiece, philosopher and blowhard Nick Bostrom, sums up the transhumanist perspective of the future by describing the only 4 possible outcomes this worldview can imagine: extinction, recurrent collapse, a totalitarian plateau, and what they refer to as posthumanism, in his essay, The Future of Humanity. Extinction as an outcome is self-explanatory and a potentially valid concern given the tendency for it to happen to all species on a long enough timeline. However, I would argue that we're at a greater risk of extinction as a result of our technology and science rather than better off for it, but that's just a side note. Recurrent collapse is also a valid potential future for humanity, in my opinion, because I think we're already experiencing such a thing. But Bostrom posits this as unacceptable because, in the convoluted transhumanist worldview, humanity always goes from less technologically complex to more, never the reverse. Homo habilis, our first human-like ancestors, evolved some 20 million years ago. Homo sapiens, 100,000 years ago, he writes. The agricultural revolution began in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East 10,000 years ago, and the rest is history. It seems an obvious oversight not to consider that collapse has probably already happened, but Bostrom makes it clear that we were never more than savages in the past, and only the refining power of technology has ever brought us closer to God. Next, Bostrom imagines the somehow more palatable outcome where humanity reaches a plateau in complexity, population density, and so on through absolute biological and ideological homogeneity, through totalitarianism, as demonstrated in his enthusiastic description of this scenario. The capability of recording, surveillance, biometrics, and data mining technologies will grow, making it increasingly feasible to keep track of where people go, whom they meet, what they do, and what goes on inside their bodies. Among the most important potential developments are ones that would enable us to alter our body directly through technological means. The ancient, but hitherto mostly futile quest for happiness could meet with success if scientists could develop safe and effective methods of controlling the brain circuitry responsible for subjective well-being. The plateau pattern is consistent with a situation of complete stasis, such as might result, for example, from the rise of a very stable political system propped up by greatly increased powers of surveillance and population control, and which, for one reason or another, opts to preserve its status quo. It would be criminally naive for us to approach a future that sounds this dystopian, with faith in the altruistic goodness of scientists and their corporate and state benefactors armed with such reality-shaping powers over us. I mean, the skin crawls right off my body reading that. How could you sound so positively enthusiastic for so objectively terrifying an idea? This kind of starry-eyed obsession with technological advancement in the face of obviously fraught ethical concerns demonstrates a proto-religious fascination with frontier science and a psychopathy of amorality, which leads us to the final of the only 4 conceivable futures for mankind: posthumanism. In this nightmarish dystopia, humans have hacked their DNA to an unrecognizable degree and joined an AI hive mind that enforces both biological and ideological compliance. It is a universe of mechanical efficiency and the ideal of perfection, if you're the fucking demiurge. Conveniently, Bostrom speaks to the challenges of predicting the future in the essay, The Future of Humanity. The future of humanity need not be a topic on which all assumptions are entirely arbitrary and anything goes. There is a vast gulf between knowing exactly what will happen and having absolutely no clue about what will happen. Our actual location is some offshore place in that gulf. Which sounds nice, but explicitly confirms what we all know but aren't going to say out loud, that our ability to predict is limited to prior experience, and we're at best guessing with some degree of aptitude. And how much is anyone's guess? We are required to forgive science for its mistakes, after the fact. But we're never allowed to question them in advance. What I'm trying to point out here is that transhumanist logic is circular and bears no significant distinction from any other faith-based mentality. Transhumanism is faith in technological advancement, the religion of science. There is no more evidence that the transhumanist vision of the future is accurate than the Christian one, or the Mayan one for that matter. Though science is its mascot, ironically, transhumanism is patently unscientific and primarily theosophical, which is to say, religious, by virtue of having to take certain disputable facts as true on the basis of nothing more than dogma. It requires that you believe that human progress is linear, and that there is no divine purpose for humanity, and that there is something fundamentally unacceptable about living and dying as a human. Nothing can be off the table when it comes to the advancement of science or of the transhumanist agenda, because without it, humanity is doomed to recurrent collapse or worse. Quoting the Transhumanist Declaration, it would be tragic if the potential benefits failed to materialize because of technophobia and unnecessary prohibitions. Yeah, it would be tragic if anything got in the way of pharma companies playing fast and loose with experimental gene therapies, or the green economy deindustrializing the West, or the state blanketing every aspect of our lives in total surveillance. Tragic. These ideas are clearly elitist and problematic, and I will strongly argue that they are also decidedly anti-life and anti-human. But where did these ideas come from? And how did they become so pervasive? The influence of Friedrich Nietzsche on the forebears of transhumanism should not be overlooked. It could be argued that Nietzsche himself was not describing a transhumanist future when he published his much maligned concept of the Übermensch, or Superman, which I suspect he meant more in a spiritual sense than a genetic or purely physical one. Regardless, the transhumanist ideal of posthumanism feels at least culturally adjacent to Nietzsche's attempts to describe a more perfect human state. After Nietzsche, Bostrom does the heavy lifting for me here in the history of transhumanism by identifying Aldous Huxley and his brother Julian Huxley, distinguished biologist and the first Director General of UNESCO, as the origins of the transhumanist movement. Julian Huxley wrote, "The human species can, if it wishes, transcend itself in its entirety as humanity. We need a new name for this belief. Perhaps transhumanism will serve. Man remaining man, but transcending himself by realizing new possibilities of and for his human nature." The paper Julian Huxley and the Continuity of Eugenics in 20th Century Britain describes Huxley as a chameleon-like figure, adept at fitting in within current social rhetoric while pursuing a social agenda defined by long-held evolutionary convictions, referring to as transhumanism. During the 1950s, Huxley redefined eugenics as socially progressive, in contrast to Nazism. By linkages to welfare states and offering solutions to poverty and disease, he adeptly associated eugenics with a range of reformist movements, such as the popularization of birth control, the decriminalization of homosexuality, and abortion law reform. Biological factors show how Huxley linked these agendas, often quite detached from eugenics, to eugenic modernization. In short, Huxley was a talented public figure and manipulator of social consciousness, and rebranded eugenics by swapping race with class as the determining factor in a person's life. The paper continues. The historical consensus is of Huxley as a modernizer and reformer, seeking to establish eugenics as a part of an agenda of social planning and to shape the emergent welfare state on biological lines. Within the eugenics society, this meant collaborating with other social progressives, combining left-of-center thinking with biological thought. Huxley sought to legitimize the social agenda of eugenics through social progressivism, with ideals like prioritizing family allowances to encourage professional middle classes to have children of good eugenic quality, and eliminating mental defect by reproductive controls. He advocated for segregating people with mental illnesses to prevent their reproduction. And rather than a free market economy, he advocated for controls on the economic and social system to advance the reproduction of the most successful stocks, particularly of the professional classes. Huxley promoted eugenics as a sacred ideal in the hope that religion would advance his ideals of social evolution. Huxley's social circle was filled with dramatic and morally challenged characters. One of his favorite friends and first UNESCO director was the Jesuit priest Pierre Teilhard del Chardin. Teilhard was a leading actor in the Pit-Down Man fraud, in which a human skull was combined with an orangutan jaw to demonstrate the transitional form in evolution, which became a famous scandal. In 1904, Francis Galton gave a speech at one of Huxley's lectures at the London School of Economics, which was later published in the American Journal of Sociology as Eugenics, Its Definition, Scope, and Aims, which included this revealing passage. Persistence in setting forth the national importance of eugenics includes 3 stages to be passed through. 1, it must be made familiar as an academic question until its exact importance has been understood and accepted as a fact. 2, it must be recognized as a subject whose practical development deserves serious consideration. 3, it must be introduced into the national conscience, like a new religion. It has indeed strong claims to become an orthodox religious tenet of the future, for eugenics cooperate with the workings of nature by securing that humanity shall be represented by the fittest races. What nature does blindly, slowly, and ruthlessly, man may do providently, quickly, and kindly. Continuing to capitalize on the broad appeal of spirituality, in 1941 Huxley published Religion Without Revelation, a manifesto for a socially founded humanist religion, which would save us from ourselves by helping us outgrow old superstitions and evolve to a stage where a new religion would be needed. Where his brother Aldous fretted over the coming dystopia in his book Brave New World, Julian seemed to embrace it by proselytizing for an evolutionary religion based on objective science rather than revelation, paraphrasing that paper again. Transhumanism, at its source, is a false religion, a cult of science, and an attempt to kill God and replace natural order with a man-made one in pursuit of synthetic apotheosis. The entire philosophy is steeped in religious metaphors of digital transcendence. Scientists may be the priest class of this cult, but you can hardly miss the religious fervor in their language. After Huxley retrofitted eugenics to be more palatably progressive for a post-Nazi world by co-presencing transhumanism with sexual liberation, conservation of natural resources, and socialism, it was absorbed by a variety of progressive futurists and other thinkers, but transhumanism really blossomed in the minds and works of science fiction authors like H.G. Wells and later Isaac Asimov, who both spun tales of the descendants of mankind being controlled by smarter, more evolved races of superior posthumans. A variety of thinkers and progressives carried the torch on into the modern age, including the futurist F.M. Esfandiari, whose assumed name, FM-2030, gives me more than a slight pause these days, considering the WEF's active promotion of a 2030 agenda, and so forth. In a very relevant quote, Esfandiari asked, "Who are the new revolutionaries of our time?" They are the geneticists, biologists, physicists, cryonologists, biotechnologists, nuclear scientists, cosmologists, radio astronomers, cosmonauts, social scientists, youth corps volunteers, internationalists, humanists, science fiction writers, normative thinkers, inventors. They and others are revolutionizing the human condition in a fundamental way. Their achievements and goals go far beyond the most radical ideologies of the old order. Bostrom qualifies this by offering a definition of transhumanism such as FM might have given himself, defining a transhuman as a transitional human, someone who by virtue of their technology usage, cultural values, and lifestyle constitutes an evolutionary link to the coming era of posthumanity. The signs that FM saw as indicative of transhuman status include prostheses, plastic surgery, intensive use of telecommunications, a cosmopolitan outlook and a globe-trotting lifestyle, androgyny, mediated reproduction such as in vitro fertilization, absence of religious belief, and a rejection of traditional family values. Esfandiari's words feel incredibly prophetic for someone who died right at the turn of the millennia, describing with alarming accuracy the likely contemporary human of 2030. But it was Max Moore who actually brought the cult of science into the light in the 90s with his idealistic version of progressive futurism. Nick Bostrom writes of Moore in The History of Transhumanism. Max Moore wrote the first definition of transhumanism in its modern sense and created his own distinctive brand of transhumanism, extropianism, which emphasized the principles of boundless expansion, self-transformation, dynamic optimism, intelligent technology, and spontaneous order. Originally, extropianism had a clear libertarian favor, but in later years Moore has distanced himself from this ingredient, replacing spontaneous order with open society, a principle that opposes authoritarian social control and promotes decentralization of power and responsibility. Well, at least there's that. But Moore's naive idealism, of course, misses the obvious problem of the unequal distribution of technology and the potential for corruption at the level of nation-states and multinational corporations. Or at least he overlooks it, since Huxley's original aspirations, transhumanism has been a proto-religious cult engaged in an influence campaign to promote its ideology. Max Moore's contribution has been to normalize transhumanism and focus attention on its progressivist-aligned values rather than the fascism implied in its ultimate goals. Yet, One can't deny the callously accelerationist attitude Moore conveys in his famous quote, "No more gods, no more faith, no more timid holding back. The future belongs to post-humanity." Sounds like a true believer to me. Moore's ultimate goal appears to be escaping death via synthetic immortalization. He and his wife, an outspoken transhumanist in her own right, led the Alcor Life Extension Foundation for many years. Alcor lobbies for researches and performs cryonics with hopes of resurrecting dead, wealthy people in the event some future technology makes it possible to do so. While none of Moore's ideas promote the more negative aspects of transhumanism directly, it is clear that class is a greater determining factor than race or anything else in Moore's utopian progressivist future. Finally, we come to Nick Bostrom himself, Swedish philosopher at Oxford University, who has written and presented most exhaustively on the subject of transhumanism, extolling its virtues and essential importance at great length. Bostrom, if you recall, gave us the 4 possible outcomes for humanity: extinction, recurrent collapse, totalitarian plateau, and posthumanism. Bostrom, like most transhumanists, is gripped by an unhealthy obsession with death and the pursuit of immortality. Synthetic apotheosis is the ultimate goal by joining with the AI God we create through the singularity, with the abilities of uploading our consciousness and hacking our biology as important milestones on the way to this goal. Max Moore's wife, Natasha Vita-Moore, describes the goal in this way. A transhuman is an evolutionary stage from being exclusively biological to becoming post-biological. Post-biological means a continuous shedding of our biology and merging with machines. And nothing in transhumanism seems to allow for objective dispute, let alone prioritization, warns the prescient 2006 paper, Transhumanism, Medical Technology, and Slippery Slopes. Of course, transhumanists such as Max Moore find no such disquietude. His phrase, "no more timidity," is a typical token of transhumanist slogans. We applaud advances in therapeutic medical technologies, but in the absence of a telos, of clearly and substantively specified ends beyond the mere banner of enhancement, medical professionals and bioethicists alike ought to resist the potentially open-ended transformations of human nature. Of course, caution is warranted when making edits to our species' biological programming that can't be undone. There are always kinks, bugs in the code that humans introduce, especially when experimenting. But it is dogma in the cult of science that we are subject to the demands of our scientific potential. To achieve our full potential, we have to dive headfirst down any slippery slope we encounter. In 2010, Professor Benjamin Noyes coined the phrase accelerationism to describe an emerging countercultural movement embracing the most destructive and anti-human aspects of both the right and the left in a post-structuralist, nihilistic attempt to force society into a transformation. Alt-right philosopher Nick Land is most often credited with the origins of accelerationism and certainly contributed to its political bipolarism, as his personal philosophy embraces both post-capitalism and Marxism performatively and provocatively. In a piece on the rise of accelerationism in 2017, The Guardian quotes Professor Noyes saying, "If capitalism is going too fast, accelerationists say that it needs to go faster. If capitalism hits a bump in the road and slows down, as it has since the 2008 financial crisis, they say it needs to be kickstarted." Noyes noted an increase in receptivity to these ideas, particularly online and in alt-right circles where they say, Land in particular has become a name to conjure with, as commenters have excitedly noted the connections between some of his ideas and the thinking of both libertarian Silicon Valley billionaire Peter Thiel and Trump's one-time strategist Steve Bannon. The accelerationists were academic punks, edgy alt-culture warriors, and not much else, and don't represent the kind of imminent danger that the transhumanist globalists do. But that's not why they are relevant. The accelerationists represent a punk version of the corporate elitism of transhumanism, and the two would seem politically incompatible except that neither are honest about their politics, neither the transhumanists or the accelerationists. If there is really any difference, value humanity, natural order, or liberty, and are actively trying to subvert all three in pursuit of the promise of a future they cannot even imagine clearly enough to articulate. And in the case of accelerationism, their contribution is all emotional energy, all piss and vinegar, but little more than theater. If transhumanism is the left brain of technofascism, accelerationism is its right brain, creative, provocative, and emotional. But they envision the same just because we can, we must world without ethical limits. Quoting the Accelerate Manifesto, We declare that only a Promethean politics of maximal mastery over society and its environment is capable of either dealing with global problems or achieving victory over capital, preserving the gains of late capitalism while going further than its value system, governance structures, and mass pathologies will allow. The left must take advantage of every technological and scientific advance made possible by capitalist society. And the choice facing us is severe, either a globalized post-capitalism or a slow fragmentation towards primitivism, perpetual crisis, and planetary ecological collapse. The future needs to be constructed. So gradually the cult of science is starting to say the quiet part out loud, that they can't really afford for any of us to have the ability to dissent, to slow down their progress. Dogma has no place in science. It is the inflexible skeletal structure of religions, which prop up belief in the absence of evidence. In science, the evidence is everything, and there's no need for belief because the facts speak for themselves. The need to enforce dogma by censoring opposition implies the lack of factual evidence, which, in turn, implies the absence of scientific rigor and substitution with faith in a religious belief. When science succumbs to the demands of a prevailing narrative, it ceases being science and becomes propaganda, and it is really crucial to be able to recognize when that happens. Allowing state and corporate agendas to dominate collective human interest is a dangerously slippery slope. The powers that be do not relinquish the powers we give them, and we have given them many new powers in the last few years, out of fear and in distraction. It's essential that we stop listening to the anti-science propaganda that public officials, the corporate class, the media, and other globalist-controlled institutions, which is sadly most of them, are substituting for our reality. I demonstrated in episode 16 that we can't trust peer-reviewed literature, which is to say, modern science, and in this episode I've revealed the source of the rot at the core of our scientific institutions and its nefarious purpose. Transhumanism and accelerationism both are the delusional pursuit of synthetic apotheosis, and the resulting proto-religious fervor is not science. The post-human story that transhumanism believes is not an empirical truth, it's a dystopian fever dream. We can choose a different future to believe in. And if we don't, the irrational dogma of transhumanist ideals will pursue frontier science right over the edge of our humanity, and we will not be able to find our way back. Do we really want to manifest the Warhammer 40k future? A grim, dark dystopia ruled by a tyrannical priest class and their half-man, half-god, all-machine emperor, perpetually keeping the chaos of our own creation at bay, filled with biologically enhanced slaves and soldiers? Because if we want Warhammer 40k, this is how we get Warhammer 40k, by turning empirical science into imperial dogma. What's the alternative? First, we have to really deeply understand that most of what we're told is true and reliable information these days is anything but. And this is particularly true when experts are quoted and science is invoked. It's not that we have to forget everything we know and return to the Dark Ages, but we do need to stop trusting blindly in scientific expertise and begin to evaluate what we're told with careful discernment. We have to choose to think for ourselves and to trust our gut judgment. More than that, though, we have to open our minds to the idea that the universe does not work precisely the way that we've been told, that we can explore other possibilities with an open mind and scientific rigor, that no science is ever settled, no matter who says that it is. Materialist rationalism looks like solid reality from a distance, but if you get up close, you can see the cracks for yourself. And once you see through the cracks and realize the universe is much bigger and much weirder than you were told, you can't be fooled again. It is simply a choice. What does your gut tell you about the future when you're not stressed out by the present? Do you, deep down, believe that our future is limited to 4 options? Extinction, collapse, totalitarianism, or synthetic apotheosis? Do you really believe those are the only choices? The problem with transhumanists is that they think too small and believe the only things that can happen are things that they already understand. Again, reality is too weird to comprehend, and the universe is too vast for us to possibly have encountered it all. Rationalists can only think reductively, which always leads to predictable results, but not always to what actually happens in the real world. When they get it wrong, they blame the data and try again, but their vision of the future remains unchanged dogmatically. We don't have to be affected by their inability to dream better futures. We can dream the more beautiful future that we all know is possible, and our dreams can outweigh theirs. How do we do this? From the heart, not the head. Again, it is a choice. We can choose not to believe in the cold, dead universe of the materialists. When thinking rationally produces only dark visions of the future, you must move from the head to the heart, and from thinking to feeling. With this choice, we can make another, the choice not to live in fear, not to be motivated by fear, but by wonder and awe. We can choose to see the universe is full of life and wondrous potential, and we can choose to live in right relationship with the cosmos, trusting fate, and approaching the future with optimism. Stepping out from under the false shelter of peer-reviewed science can be terrifying, or it can be liberating. We should revisit every crazy idea we've ever discarded carelessly and attempt to replicate any meaningful studies that other science has been based on, to see what holds up and what doesn't. And we should do this fearlessly, celebrating every time that we overturn bad science as a victory for truth. We can't be any worse off without the bunk science than we are with it. Old wives' tales, folk remedies, and local myths all come back on the table. Considering how long old wives' tales have been suppressed, I have no doubt that there is a treasure of lost wisdom in disregarded local traditions. And this isn't to suggest that suddenly herbalism or, say, shamanic healing should replace allopathic medicine any more than astrology can replace astronomy. They are simply different things with different applications in different situations. There's no need to choose between them. In fact, combining different approaches often yields novel new options to pursue. Rather than pitting modern science against other ways of knowing and being, we can gain an important perspective that we lost along the way somewhere. The transhumanist ethos is total domination of nature, to the point of utter biological control, something that the entropic nature of biology will never suffer. Fear motivates this obsession with control, fear of mortality, fear of the unknown, and fear of irrelevance. If we switch to a heart-centered approach, we would cease to chase the science of control, which is naturally a constraining, limiting force, and instead we would focus on aiding and supporting nature and natural processes. The right role for humanity on Earth is as its stewards, part caretaker and part assistant to Mother Nature herself, supporting the flourishing of all its many forms of life. Our genius, if applied to technology that aided nature rather than attempting, and largely failing, to dominate her, could heal the harm that we've caused the Earth in far shorter time frames than we imagine. The problem is our egos. We struggle with the idea of being a part of the world, members of a larger collective to whom we owe respect and allegiance. We need very badly to be special and are reluctant to play any role but the solitary hero. The majority of our myths and stories feature incredible heroes doing things that an actual human being cannot do. It may be entertaining in some sense, but it's also disempowering because there are few examples that inspire us to work collectively, to improve gradually, or to allow things to evolve receptively. Instead, heroes intervene. They fight monsters, defeat enemies, and overcome obstacles through struggle and domination. Success implies defeating, conquering, or vanquishing, never through mutual gain or achieving equilibrium or some other means of collaboration. This framework of mind limits the ways in which we can engage challenges and prevents us from recognizing viable alternatives. Transhumanism wants the story to be all about humanity, just not in our current form, apparently. And this is why it's doomed to fail. The cosmos is not just a background for the story of humanity. Humanity is a tiny fraction of life in the universe. The nihilism of modernity comes from the same place as the inevitably dark and dystopian dreams of the transhumanists. By focusing exclusively on ourselves, we have misplaced what makes life worth living, the connectedness we experience with all living beings. Our desire to dominate nature is what causes us to be out of balance in the first place. From such a broken worldview, we cannot help but envision dark and hopeless futures. Self-reliance, self-obsession, and imagining ourselves the ultimate power in the universe robs the cosmos of its majesty. Rather than obsessing about achieving godhood and conquering the cosmos, what if we turned our focus on the Earth and becoming the best, real, biological humans we can be? What if we have massive untapped potential that we have yet to realize because our dependency on technology is both unnecessary and disruptive? Ironically, I completely understand the appeal of futurism, because materialism caught me in its web as a young man. Not so much the consumerism aspect of it, but the promise of the future. I loved sci-fi and was raised on Isaac Asimov and H.G. Wells, among others. I was fascinated by space and scientific frontiers. Futurism has a very exciting mythology that sells well to young boys who want to grow up to be heroes. But unlike the myths of the Greeks, which repeatedly warn us against the dangers of hubris, our man-made techno-mythology lacks the moral guardrails of mature cosmologies. Transhumanism, by comparison, is an adolescent fantasy where humans are the plucky hero who wins against all odds, all by themselves, and then becomes the king of the universe and never has to learn any hard lessons along the way. It is a worldview that denies the most important lessons from modernity while dancing on its grave. We're already living through postmodernity. Technology is becoming more expensive and less useful with each iteration. Few aspects of life are measurably improving, and science is broken, so we can't rely on our old tricks to save us. This is a time of realignment and reevaluation, and the excesses of transhumanism are a poor match for our current moment. Instead of forcibly accelerating our evolution in ways we can't possibly control and trading hundreds of thousands of years of species identity for unpredictable scientific horizons, instead of accelerating technological advancement, perhaps we should be slowing down, considering our actions more cautiously, and returning to the old ways of living that served our species for millions of years of evolution. The future is still a choice, and we have the power to choose differently. Thank you for tuning in to this very long 17th episode and sticking with me until the end. This has been a pretty major research project for me, so I hope that you got good value from the time that you invested. The story of transhumanism is an important one to understand if you're going to be living through the years ahead of us, because it is vital to recognize its clever grift and manipulative hand at work in the public consciousness. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. But that's a good thing, because being able to see it for what it is means that you can navigate the world more effectively despite its shadowy machinations. If you haven't yet, please subscribe to this podcast so that you get notified when new episodes come out every 2 weeks. And for more of my content, articles, videos, and other episodes, and any special promotions or discounts that I'm running on my energy healing or tarot reading services, subscribe to my email newsletter on my website at www.postmugglism.com. Thanks again for riding along with me on these last 2 episodes. If you're able, I would really appreciate you sharing this show on your social media or sending it to a friend the old-fashioned way. It's a huge help to me every time you share my stuff, so thank you very much. In the next episode, I'm going to explore the concept of spirit houses, pulling together different traditions with a special focus on the land spirits of the Yucatan where we live, called the Alush, as I'm about to build an Alush house on our property in the jungle very soon. I'm excited about this project and looking forward to sharing it with you, as well as the Alush house that we eventually build through my social media channels and so on. So look forward to that in 2 weeks and beyond. Until then, take care, and may the gods be with you.